The supervisor slammed her badge on the floor without warning. They thought she was just another quiet black nurse. That was their first mistake. She didn't say a word. She just picked up her coat, walked past them all. But outside the glass doors, someone was already waiting, with her name on a list. Before we begin the full story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. And if you believe in truth, in dignity, and in justice that doesn't care what color your skin is, then like this video and subscribe. Because tomorrow's episode continues where this one dares to end. She arrived every morning before sunrise, before the janitors finished buffing the tile floors and the cafeteria turned on its warmers. She kept her head down, wore the same white sneakers and navy scrubs, and clocked in without a word. Patients knew her by her silence. Colleagues barely knew her at all. They called her the quiet one in the halls, half with respect, half with disregard. At St. Marlow General, where image meant more than substance, quiet did not rise. She had been working there for over 3 years, and not once was she offered a supervisory shift. The new hires, most of them fresh out of school, and with skin pale enough to blend into the walls, were given prime shifts and rotation flexibility. She got the night calls, the doublebacks, and the patients that others refused to care for. No one said it aloud, but everyone knew. She was the one assigned to the combative patients, the psych holds, the terminal wards. Once, a patient had called her a slur while spitting in her direction. She cleaned it up without a word, noted the vitals, and left the room. Her supervisor never followed up. One morning, while checking on a young white girl in post-op, she noticed the child's chart had been misfiled. The medication dosage was wrong. She corrected it, saved the child from a dangerous reaction, and logged the error as protocol required. The next day, she received a warning for overstepping duties. When she tried to explain, she was told, "Let the doctors handle the hard parts. You're here to assist, not to act like a savior." It stung, not just because it was unfair, but because it wasn't new. This was how the hospital operated, silencing the quiet, amplifying the loud, protecting those who fit the image. In the staff lounge, she heard them laughing. "She takes notes like she's about to sue the place," one nurse said, snickering. Another added, "She's lucky to even be working here. Some places would have let her go already." No one spoke up for her, not the nurses who shared shifts, not the techs she covered for, not the administrator she once drove home after a night shift when her car broke down. Silence was expected of her, and so she gave it, not because she was weak, but because she was watching, learning, waiting. And though no one knew it yet, she was far from powerless. That afternoon, during a routine hallway transfer of a patient from radiology to recovery, she noticed the stretcher brakes hadn't been locked. She pointed it out quietly, as always, just loud enough for the orderly to hear. He rolled his eyes and walked off without fixing it. Minutes later, the patient nearly slid off while being shifted onto the bed. She reached just in time to stop a fall. The attending physician burst through the curtain and snapped at her, blaming her for causing panic. Before she could speak, the supervisor stormed in. "You're always in the middle of something, aren't you?" he barked, not caring for explanations. With patients in earshot, he grabbed her clipboard, ripped the pages out, and tossed them in the trash. "Don't act like you're irreplaceable, you're not." She stood still, no reaction. Nurses around her froze. One chuckled nervously, another looked away. The patient's eyes widened. A moment later, she was told to take an early break. When she returned, her access code had been disabled. Her ID card no longer opened the med room. Her name had been wiped off the next 2 shifts on the board. She waited outside the nurse manager's office, heart silent, mouth shut. When the door finally opened, the HR rep was already inside. They didn't sit. They didn't ask questions. They handed her a form that read, "Termination of employment," and pointed to a signature line. "We're moving in a new direction," was the only sentence offered. No complaint on record, no disciplinary process, no official reason, just a final remark. "It's best if you gather your things before the shift ends," quietly. As she walked back to her locker, someone had already emptied it. Her coat was draped over a plastic chair like a funeral flag. No one said goodbye. No one asked why. But every footstep she took echoed louder than any voice had spoken for her. The next morning, before the sun had touched the hospital walls, she stood outside the HR building with the signed termination form still folded in her coat pocket. Her feet were cold, not from the wind, but from the absence of purpose. Inside, the woman at the front desk glanced up only once before saying, "There's nothing left to discuss, it's final." She didn't argue. She never did. On the walk to the bus stop, she passed the back entrance where she had once helped a patient's mother carrying a car seat during a snowstorm. She saw the nurse's station window, where she'd stayed late to cover an understaffed night shift. Those walls did not remember her. Not today. When she stepped onto the bus, her ID badge still clipped to her hip, a little boy in the front seat stared at her uniform. "Are you a hero?" he asked. She looked at him, blinked once, and replied, "Not today." At home, she placed the badge inside a drawer, closed it gently, and turned off her phone. She did not cry. She did not call anyone. But that evening, her former locker contents were delivered to her doorstep. Inside the plastic bag, her old sneakers were stained with dried blood from a code blue she had helped survive 3 weeks earlier. Her notebook was torn, missing the pages where she had documented patient safety issues. A single sticky note was crumpled between the shoes. It read, "Stay out, no one wants trouble." She read it twice, then put it beside the badge in the drawer. She knew what had happened was not just a firing. It was a message, a warning, and something about that made her quieter than ever, but not smaller. Long before she ever stepped into that hospital, she had watched another woman in the same uniform walk home with her head down. Her mother, once a nurse at a private clinic in the South Side, had been fired without warning too. The reason had been vague. Like most dismissals aimed at black women in white institutions, cultural fit, poor communication, attitude issues. What they really meant was she didn't bow low enough. When her mother left that job, she didn't speak about it for weeks. Only later, when the bills piled and the apartment shrank into silence, did she mutter over cold rice and lukewarm coffee, "They don't want us to rise. They want us to obey." That memory had stayed buried in the back of her mind, stitched into every shift she worked, every injustice she swallowed. She had once dreamed of being a physician, had the grades, the drive, the mind. But during her first semester of pre-med, a guidance counselor told her maybe she should focus on patient care, not command. She changed majors 2 weeks later, went into nursing, told herself she preferred healing hands to power. But in truth, it was safer to be underestimated. It was easier to move quietly when no one expected you to lead. Still, the silence had never protected her, not really. And now, sitting in her apartment surrounded by mementos of both defeat and discipline, she replayed the image of her mother standing in a hospital hallway, holding a final paycheck that couldn't cover rent. That pain was not just hers. It ran deeper. It echoed through generations of women like her. And as she stared at the crumpled sticky note beside her badge, she realized this wasn't about a job. It was about a pattern, a system, a disease cloaked in policy and fake smiles. And if no one else would cut into it, then maybe it was her turn. But first she needed someone who could sharpen the blade. 3 days later, she walked into the first law office with a folder in hand. It held copies of her termination letter, emails with patient compliments, shift schedules, even a handwritten thank you note from a mother whose newborn she had stayed late to monitor. The receptionist smiled, took the folder, and came back 10 minutes later with a practiced apology. "The firm has decided not to take your case. No explanation was provided." She thanked her, retrieved the folder, and left without asking. Why? At the second office, a younger attorney listened halfway, glanced at her badge, and said, "It's hard to prove discrimination unless there's something overt." Was anyone recorded using slurs or making racial comments? When she said no, just silence and sudden decisions, the lawyer leaned back and sighed. "You'd be fighting a shadow, and they have better lawyers. I'd suggest letting this one go." The third office didn't even let her pass the receptionist. "We only take cases that already have media traction," the woman explained, while barely lifting her eyes from the keyboard. Each rejection hit harder, not because they doubted her, but because they didn't even need to hear her to decide. She had no shot. On the way out of the third firm, an older man in the waiting room caught her eye. He looked at her folder, then at her face and said, "They only listen when someone powerful gets angry." She stopped walking, turned slightly. "Are you powerful?" she asked. He shook his head. "No, but I used to be." He scribbled something on a business card and handed it to her. "If you ever get tired of losing quietly, call this number, but only if you're ready to change everything." That night, she placed the card beside the badge and the sticky note in the drawer. Then she closed it. Not locked, just closed. For now. 2 days after her final visit to the law firms, a blurry 32-second video surfaced online. Someone had filmed her final moments in the hospital hallway as she walked out holding her coat, while her supervisor shouted behind her and a nurse muttered under her breath. The clip caught the badge on the ground, the silence in her posture, and the way no one moved to stop it. The caption read, "Nurse fired for doing her job. Again." At first it barely made noise, a few shares, a few angry emojis. But by midnight it had passed 10,000 views. The comments began to divide like cells under heat. Some praised her calm, others questioned what she had done wrong. A few said nothing at all and just posted eye-roll emojis. But deep in the thread, someone posted her name, then her face, then her personal page. Within hours, her inbox filled with anonymous messages, some sympathetic, others violent. One read, "People like you don't belong in medicine anyway." Another, "If you want attention so bad, why not just cry like the rest of them?" She didn't reply. She didn't post. She didn't like or unlike anything. But she saw them. All of them. And when she walked out to the grocery store the next afternoon, she noticed 2 women whisper and look away when she passed. That evening, she found her apartment door taped with a note in thick black marker. No lawsuits, no lies. Her hands didn't shake when she removed it. She folded it, placed it beside the others, and lit a candle near the kitchen sink. Not for peace, for focus. Somewhere out there, the story had begun without her. And if they were going to write her name into headlines, she would make sure they spelled it right when it ended. The next morning, she sat alone at her kitchen table with the drawer open. Inside it, the badge lay next to the folded termination form, the business card, and the handwritten threats. She picked up the card, turned it over once, and dialed the number printed in neat black ink. A man answered after 2 rings, his voice low and flat like someone who spoke mostly in courtrooms and war rooms. She didn't give her name. She didn't need to. "It's time," she said simply. The man didn't ask questions. He only gave her a name and a time. "Bring nothing, say nothing, sit still." She memorized the address. That evening, dressed not in scrubs but a simple grey coat, she walked 3 blocks, took a transfer train, then boarded a rideshare that dropped her off in front of a glass office tower near the financial district. Inside, no receptionist greeted her. Instead, a woman in a tailored black suit opened a side door and waved her through. No words, just nods. They led her into a conference room with no windows, only soft yellow lighting and a long black table. 3 people waited. 1 man, 2 women. None of them smiled. On the table were 2 tablets and a sealed brown envelope. The older woman spoke. "First, you understand what this meeting means?" She nodded. The younger man added, "This is not litigation. This is acquisition." She didn't flinch. She only replied, "I want it clean. I want it quiet. I want no one to see me coming." The second woman handed her a single sheet of paper and said, "Ownership is already in motion, but full transfer. Requires a final presence." She asked one final question before she left. "If I return, how long before they know?" The older woman looked her straight in the eye and said, "That depends on how long you let them talk before you speak." That night, she slept with the lights off for the first time in weeks, not because she was safe, because she had just opened the last door. The next day, just before noon, she stood at the edge of the hospital parking lot, in a slate-grey coat and black shoes, polished to a mirror shine. The sun reflected off the windows above, as if nothing had ever happened inside them. She walked calmly to the main entrance. No ID badge, no clipboard, no need. At the sliding glass doors, The front desk nurse looked up, blinked twice, and instinctively reached for the phone. "Excuse me, ma'am. You're not cleared to be here," she said. "You're no longer part of our staff." She didn't reply. A security guard appeared from behind the elevators and approached. "You're going to have to leave now," he said, one hand near his belt. A second guard stepped out from a side hallway, blocking the west wing. Voices started to murmur behind the reception glass. Someone gasped. A few nurses peeked out from the corner of the hallway near pediatrics. One recognized her and mouthed something silent. She still didn't speak. She simply reached into her coat pocket and removed a single black envelope. She handed it to the front desk nurse. "Deliver this to whoever's in charge right now," she said. "Immediately." The nurse hesitated, then walked off, clutching the envelope like it was burning her hand. The security guards stood tense, unsure if they should act. 5 minutes passed, then 10. No one moved. At minute 11, the elevator doors dinged open, and a man in a suit stepped out. Chief Administrator. His eyes landed on her, narrowed, and then widened. "You're not allowed here," he barked. "You've already been processed. You're trespassing." She still didn't speak. Instead, she held up a small silver key. Not for a locker. For a door that no one else remembered. The administrator stepped forward, raised his voice louder. "I said this is private property." She stepped aside slightly. Behind her, the glass doors opened again. A black SUV rolled to a stop. Out stepped a woman in heels, long coat, briefcase in hand, followed by a man in a legal vest and 2 individuals in business attire. They walked directly past the security guards without looking at them. The woman handed a second envelope to the administrator and said clearly, "We're here to execute the transfer." The silence that followed was not confusion. It was recognition. Every nurse who had ever doubted her, every doctor who had dismissed her, every manager who had watched her leave quietly, now stared as she stood in the middle of the lobby they once forced her to clean in silence. But today the only sound came from the printer behind the desk, printing new credentials, new assignments, new ownership, and her name was the only one at the top. She stood at the center of the hospital lobby, with the weight of silence behind her and the force of ownership beside her. The woman in the long coat stepped forward again, opened the folder she carried, and pulled out 3 stamped documents. One was the official transfer of controlling interest in the hospital's private board. One was the confirmation of investment through a silent partner fund established 18 months earlier. The third was a notarized declaration of sole executive decision rights. The administrator stared at them as if they were written in fire. His mouth opened once, then closed. No words came. Behind him, the head of HR stepped forward, face flushed, voice shaking. "This must be a mistake. There's no way she could be cleared to—" But the woman in the coat cut her off. "She is not cleared," she said flatly. "She is the clearing authority." A ripple moved through the room like thunder with no sound. Nurses whispered. A tech dropped a clipboard. A resident stared as if seeing her for the first time, but she didn't look at any of them. She only turned to the security guard still frozen near the elevator and said, "Would you please escort Mr. Brooks and Ms. Keller to the executive lounge? They will not be returning to administration today." The guard hesitated, then nodded, as if waking from a dream. The administrator began to speak again, something about contracts and legal review, but one of the legal aides stepped forward with a tablet and pressed play on a recorded board meeting from 2 months ago. Her voice was in it, so was her vote, and her authority. There was no room for debate, no loophole to escape. The hospital, for all its history and whitewashed walls, now had a new owner, and she wasn't whispering anymore. She wasn't walking behind anyone. She was standing still, letting the building catch up to her, letting the truth unfold at its own slow, delicious pace, letting them remember every time they looked past her that silence had never meant absence. It had always meant power, waiting. Mountille. Next 48 hours moved like broken glass under bare feet. News of her ownership spread through the hospital like smoke in a locked room. Some employees celebrated privately. Others stayed silent, unsure of which direction the wind was turning. But the old guard, the ones who had sat comfortably for years on unchallenged authority, did not go quietly. It started with whispers in staff meetings, rumors that she had forged her way in, that the board had been coerced, that she was a front for a larger political push. One surgeon emailed a private network accusing her of reverse discrimination, claiming he had been removed from the surgical roster for his skin color, not his ethics violations. Within a day, an anonymous blog appeared online. It called her unstable, claimed she had falsified patient records, and suggested that her return was a power grab rooted in revenge. Several conservative news outlets picked it up. The headlines painted her as a threat to institutional order. In back hallways, nurses who once smiled to her face now avoided eye contact. Someone scrawled the words, "You were never one of us," in marker across her office door. She had it wiped clean without comment, but the worst came from within. A former administrator, now disgraced, leaked fragments of outdated documents, twisting them into a narrative that claimed she had been paid under the table for silence during a malpractice settlement years prior. None of it was true. All of it looked plausible enough to catch attention. Then came the audit, initiated by an outside regulatory agency, triggered by a sudden wave of internal complaints. Inspectors arrived unannounced. Computers were checked. Records seized. Staff were interviewed. The tone was clinical, but the intent was clear. Discredit her, disqualify her, break her foundation from underneath. For a moment, the hospital froze again. Not from respect, from fear. The same fear that once kept her quiet. But she didn't retreat. She attended every meeting, answered every question, produced every document in perfect order. Her ownership. Trail was clean, her board votes legal, her financials intact. Yet still the storm raged. The system didn't want her there. Not because she was unqualified, but because she had taken power without asking permission. And those who had ruled unchecked could not accept being ruled at all. She did not post a press release. She did not go on air. She called no press conference. Instead, she walked into her office on a Monday morning with 3 brown folders in her hand and a legal team waiting in the adjacent room. Inside those folders were timelines, financial logs, digital backups, and signed minutes from board meetings, proving every step she had taken was lawful, funded, and approved. She handed them over to the regulatory auditors without blinking. Then she pulled up a conference call with the state licensing board and gave them a 2-minute statement. Direct, legal, irrefutable. By that evening, one of the anonymous blogs had gone dark. The author's identity had been subpoenaed through a defamation motion. The former administrator who had leaked false documents received a cease and desist with attached litigation from her private counsel. 2 journalists who had run stories using unnamed sources posted retractions online after being shown evidence of fabrication. But the hospital still held tension in its walls. Some staff held silent protests. Others walked out, citing workplace politics. Whispers rose about a walkout of the surgical department. She listened, she waited, and when the timing was right, she sent a simple email titled Internal Clarification. It detailed the hospital's new leadership structure, her continued legal ownership, and a reminder that any staff feeling unsafe or unheard could report directly to her newly established Equity and Ethics Board, led by outside counsel and overseen by rotating community members. That same week, a woman arrived in the hospital lobby carrying a clipboard and wearing no badge. When asked who she was, she smiled and said, "External audit. I was invited." She spent the next 6 days interviewing the very people who had launched complaints against her. On the 7th day, she handed in a report that began with one sentence, "There is no evidence of misconduct by the current owner." Attached were 7 pages outlining a history of racial bias in departmental promotion, unequal discipline protocols, and erasure of internal complaints filed by non-white staff. She read it once, printed 2 copies, and walked to the HR office, without a word. Inside, she placed 1 copy on the desk and said, "This is not a conversation, it is a record." Then she turned and walked back to her office, where for the first time since her return she sat down and closed the door, not to shut people out, but to prepare for what would come next. Because if the system wanted to test her foundation, she would bury theirs, quietly. permanently. With the truth. Within a week of the audit's release, a conservative state senator made a televised statement declaring that hospitals across the country were falling victim to ideological takeovers disguised as equity reform. Without naming her directly, he cited the St. Malo transition as a prime example, questioning whether those who had bought their way into leadership understood the discipline of clinical tradition. The next morning, the hospital's funding division received a letter from the State Department of Health announcing a surprise facilities compliance review. A thinly veiled strike. Reporters returned to the parking lot. Cameras waited at the sidewalk, and inside, the staff divided further. 3 department heads submitted resignation letters citing loss of institutional trust. A 4th sent a memo to remaining physicians proposing the creation of a parallel leadership structure to preserve long-standing operational norms. The language was clear. They wanted her gone, or at least removed from sight. When the compliance officers arrived, they came with clipboards and flashlights, checking handrails and storage rooms, but always asking questions that trailed back to leadership. She did not panic. She walked with them, answered everything, invited them to inspect files. She had nothing to hide. But even transparency does not stop sabotage. One afternoon, while walking into the lower wing of the building, she saw 2 nurses packing up their desks. They nodded politely, but one said, "We're not walking out against you. We're just tired of being in the middle." That night, her email inbox filled with threats disguised as policy questions, appeals for clarity, thinly veiled challenges wrapped in bureaucracy. The pressure was tightening around her from every angle. And then, like a crack through stone, the National Board of Hospital Accreditation issued a request for a governance review, an inquiry normally reserved for failed institutions or those under federal scrutiny. The message was clear. The system had mobilized against her, not through overt violence but through weaponized process, through institutions pretending to uphold standards while punishing her for defying silence. And even though every paper in her drawer was clean, she understood something deeper now. They were not fighting to remove her. They were fighting to erase the possibility of someone like her ever returning again. On the morning of the board review, the conference room was already full by the time she arrived. Across the table sat representatives from the National Accreditation Body, their faces blank with professional neutrality. To their right sat 2 attorneys for the hospital's former administrators, claiming to represent continuity concerns. Behind them, in a row of seats once reserved for department heads, sat 3 former executives who had either resigned or been removed during the internal restructuring. They did not look at her. She did not look at them. At exactly 9 o'clock, the review chair asked a single question. "Do you have a statement before we begin?" She stood, held no papers, and replied, "Only this. I was told not to return, that I did not belong. That silence meant weakness, but I never stopped listening, and I never stopped recording." She nodded once toward the legal assistant at her side, who pressed a button on a device projecting audio into the room. What followed was 24 minutes of recorded meetings, hallway conversations, and internal calls collected over the past 2 years. None of it illegal, all of it true. The voice of a former director mocking her credentials, a physician saying, "She's smart enough to scrub charts, not run the system." A financial officer admitting on call, "If she ever finds out what we buried, we're done." Then came the documents, signatures of key transfers, dated investments, recordings, of her voting during remote board sessions as a silent partner under legal alias. The final file was a sworn affidavit from the original majority stakeholder confirming the sale and intent to install her as future operator. The chair of the review board leaned forward, adjusted her glasses and said, "We have heard enough." In the minutes that followed, the room began to shift. One executive stood up and left without a word. Another muttered something into a phone and backed out of the door. The attorneys closed their folders, but she did not sit. She waited. And when the chair finally confirmed her ownership, her authority, and her full institutional clearance, she spoke just once more. "You didn't try to break me because I was wrong. You tried because I was quiet and I let you." Then she turned, opened the door to the hallway and found the head of maintenance waiting. He tipped his cap and handed her a new nameplate. It read, "Only her name." No title, no initials, just a door that no one else could open but her. She did not take the CEO office. She left it untouched, its door closed, its chair vacant. Instead, she walked down to the first floor, to a quiet corner that once served as a forgotten storage unit near pediatrics. Within days, that space became something else entirely. Clean walls, fresh paint. A sign on the glass that read, "Community Health Access and Support." No appointments, no billing, no insurance. A walk-in unit with one purpose only, to serve. Staffed by nurses she selected personally, most of whom had been overlooked by traditional hiring systems, the space opened quietly without announcement. And yet, within a week, it was full. Mothers, elders, teens, with nowhere else to go. She worked there once a week without ceremony. No cameras, no titles, just a stethoscope and a pen. But the impact wasn't quiet. Former patients began returning with letters. Staff who had once kept their heads down started speaking up about past abuse. A janitor confessed that he had seen what they did to her badge the day she was fired, but had been too afraid to say anything. He brought her a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the broken ID tag, pieced back together with tape. She placed it on the wall behind the clinic desk, not as a wound, but as a warning. Across the city, word spread. Not about revenge, about realignment, about a system that had cracked and then been rebuilt without permission. When asked by a reporter during a quiet visit why she never claimed the upper floor, she replied, "I didn't want the seat. I just wanted the ground beneath it to stop shifting." She walked out before the reporter could ask a second question. In the silence of her office later that evening, she packed away the final file from the accreditation hearing and closed the drawer. The same one where her badge, the threats, and the old note had once sat. All of it gone now. Nothing left but breath and time. And then, as if remembering something important, she wrote a single sentence on the back of a patient chart before leaving for the night. It read, "Quiet was never weakness. It was the sound of something building." She never told anyone the full story. Not because it was painful, but because the ones who needed to know had already lived it with her. In the quiet hum of the clinic at closing time, she often sat by the window and watched the streetlights flicker on one by one like small signals in the dark. Sometimes, a child from the neighborhood would press their face to the glass and wave. Sometimes a patient would leave a thank you note tucked in the bushes near the door. She kept them all, never framed them. Just folded them carefully and placed them in a drawer beside the old pieces of her first badge. The building still whispered, not the way it used to, not with fear or gossip or exclusion, but with the breath of movement, with voices that once stayed silent now rising in rooms she no longer had to enter. And on one quiet evening, long after the rest of the staff had gone home, she sat alone with her hands folded on the desk and whispered a sentence only meant for herself. I was never the one who needed to change. The wind tapped lightly against the window pane as if in agreement. She stood, turned off the lamp and walked out without locking the door. Outside, the city moved on, but something in it had shifted. Not loudly, not all at once, but undeniably. And somewhere, in the places where injustice still thinks it has, a home, there will always be those who underestimate a woman who does not raise her voice, but they will learn, because silence is not surrender. Silence is a decision, and power, real power, does not shout. It waits. Then asks one final question. What would you do if they thought you were nobody, and you knew you owned everything? And that is how a nurse they tried to erase became the name they could never remove. Months later, during a quiet morning before the clinic opened, she stood alone at the side entrance of the hospital with a cup of coffee in her hand and her eyes resting on the stone plaque mounted near the doorway. It had been installed just a week earlier, quietly, without ceremony. The brass was smooth, the lettering sharp and deliberate. It read, "In honor of those who were told to leave before they ever had a chance to begin." She hadn't written the inscription, One of the nurses had proposed it. The board had approved it without debate. She touched the corner of the plaque, with 2 fingers, not out of habit, but out of memory. Behind her, the building was already waking. Machines whirred softly. Staff voices murmured in early shift rhythm. A child laughed somewhere in pediatrics. It was not a perfect place. Not yet, but it was no longer a place where power hid behind policy and cruelty wore a smile. It was no longer a place where silence was confused with shame. She turned, finished the last sip of coffee, and dropped the cup into the bin without breaking stride. As she walked through the hallway toward the clinic, a new resident passed her and asked casually, "Are you with administration?" She smiled without stopping and replied, "Not exactly. I just helped build the ground you're standing on." Then she vanished into the flow of footsteps and voices, into a hospital now shaped by a woman no one had expected to return. And, though her story was done, its weight would stay behind like a shift in gravity. Quiet and undeniable, the way truth always settles when finally given a place to stand.